No one at the company dared even look at the arrogant billionaire until the janitor's sweet 7-year-old daughter approached him discreetly and offered him a simple cup of coffee that would change everything. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The coffee cup shattered against the marble wall, sending dark liquid streaming down the expensive artwork like tears. Marcus Wellington III didn't even flinch as his assistant scrambled to clean up the mess. "Pathetic," Marcus snarled, his steel-grey eyes cold as winter. 30 years old, and I'm surrounded by idiots who can't even brew decent coffee. At 6'2", with perfectly styled dark hair and a suit worth more than most people's cars, Marcus was the kind of man who commanded fear, not respect. He'd built his billion-dollar empire by crushing anyone who dared stand in his way, and today was no different. "Mrs. Chen," he called to the elderly cleaning woman who'd witnessed his outburst, "clean this up, and next time stay invisible like you're supposed to." The 60-year-old woman's hands shook as she gathered the ceramic pieces. She'd worked in this building for 15 years, watching Marcus transform from his father's spoiled son into something far worse. A man who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. Marcus returned to his corner office, slamming the door so hard his diplomas rattled on the wall. The board meeting had been brutal. His father's old business partners were circling like vultures, questioning every decision, every dollar spent. They wanted him gone, wanted to install their own puppet as CEO. "Let them try," he muttered, loosening his silk tie. "Wellington Enterprises has been in my family for 3 generations. I'll burn it down before I let those parasites take what's mine." His phone buzzed with another crisis. The downtown project was over budget, the investors were pulling out, and the media was having a field day with his latest firing spree. 12 employees this month alone, each one deserving their fate for daring to show weakness. The headache that had been building all morning now felt like a vice around his skull. Marcus pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the whispers in the hallway, the pointed looks from his remaining staff, the weight of expectations that felt heavier than his father's disappointed ghost. That's when she appeared. The office door opened without a knock, without permission, without fear. A tiny figure with sunshine blonde curls and wearing a simple blue dress stepped inside, carrying a steaming paper cup like it was made of gold. "Mister, you look really, really sad," said the little girl, her voice carrying the pure honesty only children possess. "Mama says when people are sad, they need kindness and good coffee." Marcus Wellington III, the man who'd made grown executives cry, who'd fired people via text message, who hadn't shown genuine emotion in 2 decades, found himself completely speechless. The child couldn't be more than 7, yet she looked at him without an ounce of fear or judgment. "I'm Emma," she continued, placing the cup carefully on his pristine desk. "This is special coffee. Mama made it just for you." As she spoke, something glinted on her wrist, a small silver bracelet with an inscription that made Marcus's blood run cold. Words he'd seen before, in a place he'd tried desperately to forget, connected to a tragedy that had shaped the very monster he'd become. Marcus stared at the bracelet until his vision blurred, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Hope, that single word engraved in delicate script, sent him spiraling back 23 years to a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying dreams. His hands trembled as memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice under pressure. Emma tilted her head, puzzled by the dramatic change in this scary man's demeanor. Gone was the shouting monster from moments before, replaced by someone who looked broken. "Daddy gave it to me before he went to heaven," she said with the matter-of-fact acceptance only children possess about tragedy. "He said it would keep me safe when bad things happen. Mama cries sometimes, but I tell her the bracelet still works." The coffee cup trembled so violently in Marcus's hands that coffee sloshed over the rim, staining his $1,000 shirt. David Chen. The name detonated in his mind like a bomb, unleashing a flood of guilt he'd spent decades trying to bury. The same David Chen who'd worked construction on his father's first major project, who'd risked his own life crawling through twisted scaffolding to save a 10-year-old boy, who'd visited that terrified child in the hospital for 3 straight days. The same David Chen who died in the hospital 3 months ago while Marcus was in Europe, too busy closing another heartless acquisition to notice that his childhood savior had left this world. Your daddy. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. What was his full name, sweetheart? Chen. Daddy's name was David Chen, and Mama's name is Maria, Emma replied, swinging her small legs from the oversized chair. She works here cleaning all the floors because we need money for food and rent. Our apartment is really small, but Mama says we're lucky to have it. She works at 2 other places too, but I like it best when she brings me here because the elevators are fun. The world tilted on its axis. Marcus gripped his mahogany desk so hard his knuckles went white, remembering with crystal clarity David's calloused hands pulling him from certain death, David's kind eyes filled with genuine concern for a stranger's child, David's gentle voice promising that good people still existed in this cruel world. And Marcus, ungrateful, selfish Marcus, had never even bothered to learn if his savior was still alive. Emma! A worried voice called from the hallway, followed by rapid footsteps on marble floors. A petite Hispanic woman appeared in the doorway, her cleaning uniform wrinkled from hours of backbreaking work, her weathered face pale with absolute terror. Mija! You can't bother the importante señor like this. Maria Chen rushed into the office, her movements quick and nervous like a sparrow around a predator. She'd heard the stories whispered in the employee break room, how Marcus Wellington had fired Jenny from accounting for sneezing during a quarterly meeting, how he'd reduced the maintenance supervisor to tears last Tuesday over a minor scheduling conflict, how he'd closed the company daycare without warning because it wasn't cost-effective. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Wellington," Maria stammered, her accent thickening with fear as she pulled Emma toward the door. "She doesn't understand about important business. Please, please don't fire me. We have nowhere else to go if I lose this job. I'll work double shifts to make up for the interruption." But Marcus wasn't the same man who'd shattered coffee cups against priceless artwork an hour ago. He was drowning in the memory of being a lost 10-year-old boy, remembering the overwhelming warmth of being truly seen, truly cared for by a stranger who'd expected nothing in return except the simple acknowledgement that one human life mattered. "Wait," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotions he'd forgotten how to name. "The coffee, it's absolutely perfect." Maria Chen's hands never stopped moving, even in sleep. In their cramped one-bedroom apartment above a corner grocery store, she was constantly in motion, washing dishes in the tiny kitchenette, mending Emma's school clothes by lamplight, or planning the next day's exhausting route through Wellington Enterprises' 50 floors of corporate indifference. "Mama, why do you work so much?" Emma asked from the thrift store table, where she was carefully coloring inside the lines of a tattered coloring book. "Mrs. Rodriguez next door says her mama is home when she gets back from school." Maria's hands paused for just a moment over the sink full of dishes. "Because, mi papito, we have to be strong for each other. Daddy taught us to never give up, remember? He's watching over us from heaven, making sure we're brave." The truth was infinitely more complicated and terrifying. David's cancer had been aggressive, the treatments experimental and expensive. Even with insurance, the medical bills had drained their modest savings account and forced them to take out loans against their small house. When David died, the life insurance barely covered the funeral costs, leaving Maria with a mountain of debt and a 7-year-old daughter who asked every night when Daddy was coming home. The house had been foreclosed on 6 weeks after the funeral. Now, Maria worked 3 different cleaning jobs: Wellington Enterprises during the day, a law firm in the evenings, and weekend shifts at a medical complex, just to keep Emma in the same school and food on their table. But she never let her daughter see the panic attacks that kept her awake at 3 in the morning, calculating and recalculating whether they'd make rent this month. At Wellington Enterprises, Maria had perfected the art of being functionally invisible. She cleaned around important meetings without making eye contact, emptied trash cans while executives screamed profanities into their phones about stock prices and hostile takeovers, and pretended not to understand English when she overheard the cruel jokes about the help and their proper place in the social hierarchy. For 2 years, she'd watched Marcus Wellington destroy people's careers with the casual cruelty of a child pulling wings off flies. She'd seen him fire a pregnant receptionist for taking too many bathroom breaks, watched him humiliate senior executives in front of their teams, witnessed him shut down charitable initiatives that might have helped families like hers. But something inexplicable had changed yesterday when Emma wandered into his office with that paper cup of coffee. Maria had expected the worst: termination, threats, maybe even legal trouble for allowing her child in the building. Instead, she'd glimpsed something impossible: a hairline crack in the monster's carefully constructed armor. "Mrs. Chen." Marcus's voice made her jump so violently that cleaning solution splashed across the supply closet floor. He stood in the narrow doorway, his usually perfect appearance somehow disheveled, looking oddly uncomfortable in his $10,000 suit. "See, Mr. Wellington," she managed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your husband, David, he worked construction, didn't he? About 23 years ago." Maria's breath caught in her throat. In her 2 years of employment here, Marcus Wellington had never spoken her name, never acknowledged her existence beyond barked orders to clean up his messes. How could he possibly know David's name, much less his occupation from decades past? "Yes, senor. He was a very good man, worked hard his whole life." "He was." Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Maria was shocked to see what looked suspiciously like tears gathering in his steel-grey eyes. "I knew him a long time ago. He saved my life once." The industrial mop bucket slipped from Maria's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the concrete floor and sending soapy water spreading across the room. "Kay, id." The Wellington Enterprises boardroom felt like a gladiatorial arena as Marcus walked in 23 minutes late, his usually immaculate appearance betraying signs of a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his tie was slightly crooked, and for the first time in his corporate career, he'd forgotten to polish his Italian leather shoes. The usual predatory smiles of his father's old business partners widened with barely concealed delight. Weakness was blood in shark-infested waters to men like these. "Rough night, Marcus," sneered Theodore Blackstone, the silver-haired corporate vulture who'd been circling Wellington Enterprises like a patient carrion bird for the past 5 years. His manicured fingers drummed against the polished conference table with calculated rhythm. Perhaps the enormous pressures of leadership are becoming too much for someone so young. "The quarterly projections are deeply concerning," added Victoria Sterling, her scarlet lipstick as sharp and predatory as her carefully honed ambitions. She'd been Harrison Wellington's protégé before his death, and she'd never forgiven Marcus for inheriting what she believed should have been hers. The board is beginning to seriously wonder if fresh perspective might be needed at the helm. Marcus barely registered their verbal attacks. His mind kept drifting away from corporate warfare to more important battles. Maria's work-worn hands scrubbing floors until past midnight. Emma's trusting smile as she offered kindness to a man who'd forgotten how to receive it. David Chen's ultimate sacrifice that he'd repaid with decades of willful indifference to human suffering. The corporate wolves circling the mahogany table suddenly seemed less like apex predators and more like parasites, feeding off the misery of people they'd never bothered to see as human. The downtown housing project, Blackstone continued, consulting his leather portfolio with theatrical precision. Your personal pet charity case is hemorrhaging money at an unprecedented rate. The construction delays, the cost overruns, the complete lack of projected return on investment. It's financially irresponsible. I moved to cut our losses immediately and sell the property to Meridian Development. That project, Marcus said slowly, each word carefully measured, provides affordable housing for low-income families, including single mothers working multiple jobs to keep their children fed and housed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Confused glances ricocheted around the table like pinballs. Marcus Wellington defending poor people, the same ruthless businessman who'd eliminated the company daycare center to improve quarterly profit margins, the same man who'd fired an entire department via email while they were at a company retreat. Since when do you care about charity cases and bleeding heart social programs? Victoria laughed, the sound as cold and sharp as winter wind through cemetery headstones. Since yesterday, Marcus realized with startling clarity, since a 7-year-old girl with golden pigtails looked at him without fear, without judgment, without the calculating self-interest that poisoned every other human interaction in his adult life. Since he'd learned that the people he'd dismissed as invisible furniture were actually the foundation keeping his entire world from collapsing. The project continues as planned, Marcus stated with quiet finality that surprised even himself. This is unacceptable, Blackstone hissed, abandoning all pretense of civility. Your father would be ashamed of this weakness. Something dark and dangerous flashed across Marcus's face. My father was a lot of things, Theodore. But he knew the value of loyalty to people who'd earned it. The executive elevator climbed toward the penthouse floors as Marcus clutched a manila folder that had remained locked in his personal safe for 15 tortuous years. His hands shook slightly as he felt the weight of its contents. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age, medical records he'd never had the courage to read completely, and one photograph that had haunted his dreams since childhood. A testament to the single moment when a stranger's kindness had saved not just his life, but his faith in human decency. His corner office felt like an expensive mausoleum tonight, filled with awards and accolades that suddenly seemed meaningless. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glittered with a million lights, but all Marcus could see was the past. A terrified 10-year-old boy trapped beneath tons of fallen scaffolding, crying for his father, who was too busy negotiating contracts in an air-conditioned trailer to visit the dangerous construction site where real men risked their lives to build his empire. David Chen had been just another nameless worker in a yellow hard hat that day, one of dozens of men his father paid minimum wage to pour concrete and weld steel. But when the scaffolding collapsed due to his father's cost-cutting measures on safety equipment, David hadn't hesitated for a single second. He'd crawled through a maze of twisted metal and concrete debris, risking his own life to pull out a stranger's child, whose father valued profit margins over basic human safety. "You're gonna be okay, mijo," David had whispered during the ambulance ride to Chicago General, his own face bloody from falling debris. "Your papa loves you very much." Sometimes grown-ups just forget how to show it when they're scared. Marcus had spent 3 days in the hospital with a concussion and broken ribs. David visited every single day, bringing comic books purchased with his meager paycheck and telling terrible construction worker jokes until Marcus smiled through his pain. He'd promised to visit the boy at home once he was released, to make sure he was healing properly, but Harrison Wellington had forbidden any further contact. "We don't associate with the help," his father had declared, with the casual cruelty that Marcus would later inherit like a genetic disease. The man did his job adequately. Nothing more is required. The manila folder slipped from Marcus's trembling fingers, its precious contents scattering across his pristine desk like autumn leaves. Photographs captured moments he'd tried desperately to forget. David Chen grinning beside a bandaged 10-year-old in a hospital bed. David receiving a modest bonus check that Harrison had grudgingly provided, probably more to avoid bad publicity than genuine gratitude. David's wedding photograph with young Maria, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness Marcus had never experienced. And the last photograph, David's obituary from exactly 3 months ago, the ink still sharp enough to cut. Beloved husband and father, survived by wife Maria and daughter Emma, services at St. Mary's Catholic Church. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. Marcus had been in Milan that week, acquiring another company he didn't need to add to his portfolio of corporate conquests. While David Chen was being lowered into frozen ground surrounded by people who genuinely mourned his passing, Marcus had been calculating profit margins and terminating employees via email from his luxury hotel suite. The intercom buzzed with mechanical precision. "Mr. Wellington, building security is requesting clarification about the new cleaning protocols. Apparently, there's been a formal complaint filed about unauthorized personnel accessing executive areas during business hours." Victoria Sterling's poison was spreading through the building like industrial toxin through groundwater. Marcus stared at the scattered photographs and made a decision that would have shocked his younger, crueler self. "Tell security that Maria Chen and her daughter Emma have permanent executive-level access, effective immediately. Anyone who has a problem with that directive can schedule a personal meeting with me to discuss their concerns." But even as he spoke with newfound conviction, Marcus knew the real war was just beginning. Emma's small hand slipped trustingly into Marcus's calloused palm as they stood together before David Chen's grave in the modest Catholic section of Graceland Cemetery. The headstone was simple granite, neither expensive nor imposing, but engraved with words that made Marcus's throat constrict with barely controlled emotion. David Miguel Chen, beloved father and husband. He saw good in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. "Ah, Daddy would have really liked you," Emma said, with the absolute certainty that only 7-year-olds can muster about matters of the heart. "Mama told me you knew him when you were little like me. She said he saved you from getting really hurt, and that's why Daddy was a hero even before I was born." Maria knelt carefully to place fresh white roses by the headstone, her movements reverent and practiced, the weekly ritual of a woman keeping love alive through grief. She'd been shocked to her core when Marcus Wellington had quietly asked to visit David's resting place, even more stunned when he'd privately arranged to pay their overdue rent and Emma's mounting school fees without fanfare or conditions. "He talked about you sometimes over the years," Maria said softly, her accented voice carrying the same gentle strength that David's had possessed. The little boy he helped long ago. David never forgot a kindness received or a kindness given. He used to say that saving you was the proudest moment of his working life, better than any paycheck or promotion. Marcus's carefully constructed emotional walls, built from decades of deliberate cruelty and willful indifference, crumbled completely like a dam giving way to floodwaters. Tears he hadn't shed since childhood tracked down his face without shame. "I should have been at his funeral. I should have known he was sick. I should have helped your family when David couldn't work anymore. I had the resources, the connections, the power to make a difference, and I did nothing." "Ah, you couldn't have known, mijo," Maria said with maternal wisdom, reaching out to briefly touch his arm. "But you know now. You're here now. That's what matters to David's spirit, and that's what matters to us." As they walked slowly back to Marcus's car, Emma chattering cheerfully about her daddy's favorite baseball team and his terrible singing voice, Marcus's phone buzzed relentlessly with increasingly frantic messages. The board was in emergency session. Victoria Sterling had called an unprecedented investor meeting. Theodore Blackstone was aggressively pushing for an immediate vote of no confidence. The corporate piranhas were circling for the kill. "They're coming for me," Marcus murmured, scrolling through the hostile text messages with growing resignation. "Let them come," Maria said firmly, her spine straightening with defiant strength. David used to say that when you finally stand up for what's right, you discover who your real friends are. And you also learn that some fights are worth having, even if you lose. But Marcus knew the brutal truth with crystalline clarity. He had no real friends in that corporate battlefield. He'd systematically burned every bridge, crushed every potential ally, surrounded himself with yes men and opportunistic parasites who would abandon him the moment his power wavered. Now, when he desperately needed support, he was utterly and completely alone. Except for a widowed cleaning woman and her 7-year-old daughter who somehow saw something worth saving in a man the entire world had written off as irredeemably lost. That evening, alone in his sterile penthouse apartment overlooking the city he'd conquered but never loved, Marcus made a phone call he'd never imagined himself making. The number had been carefully preserved in David's personal effects, which Maria had courageously shared with him, along with photograph albums and handwritten letters that painted a picture of a man who'd lived with purpose and died with dignity. Roberto Chen speaking. The voice was professionally crisp but carried echoes of David's warmth. "This is Marcus Wellington. I'm David's son, the boy your brother saved 23 years ago." A long pause filled with weight and memory. "Jesus, David talked about you constantly. He always wondered what happened to that scared little kid, whether you'd grown up happy and safe. Roberto, I need help, legal help. The board is trying to remove me from my own company, and I know it's time I honored your brother's memory the way he deserved." "What exactly did you have in mind?" Marcus looked out at the Chicago skyline, thinking of Maria working 3 soul-crushing jobs, of Emma's innocent trust in a world that had already taken her father, of all the David Chens laboring in shadows while men like his father built empires on their backs. "I want to change everything. But first, I need to survive what's coming tomorrow morning." The boardroom erupted in chaos as Marcus entered at exactly 8 a.m., flanked by a man Theodore Blackstone didn't recognize, a sharp-eyed Hispanic lawyer carrying a briefcase that seemed to radiate quiet menace. Roberto Chen had arrived on the red-eye from Houston, and his resemblance to his deceased brother was so striking that Marcus felt his chest tighten with renewed grief and determination. "Gentlemen, ladies." Marcus's voice carried a new authority that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "I believe you called this meeting to discuss my fitness to lead this company. Before we begin, I'd like you to meet my legal counsel, Roberto Chen of Chen and Associates." Victoria Sterling's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her sudden pallor. "This is highly irregular, Marcus. Family business shouldn't require outside legal intervention." "Me family business?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Is that what we're calling 20 years of systematic embezzlement and fraud? Because that's what my investigation has uncovered." The temperature in the room plummeted. Blackstone's silver pen clattered to the table, and Victoria's scarlet lips formed a tight line that could have cut glass. Around the table, the other board members, Harrison Wellington's old cronies who'd grown fat and lazy on questionable deals, began to perspire despite the aggressive air conditioning. Roberto opened his briefcase with deliberate precision, removing a thick stack of documents. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at is 3 months of forensic accounting work. Phantom construction companies, inflated material costs, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. The downtown housing project wasn't hemorrhaging money due to mismanagement. It was being systematically looted by certain board members who assumed Mr. Wellington would never bother to investigate his own inheritance. "This is ridiculous," Blackstone sputtered, his usual composure cracking like ice in spring. "Harrison Wellington was my closest friend. I would never—" "My father was a lot of things," Marcus interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "But he wasn't stupid. These documents show he was building a case against you before his heart attack. He just died before he could act on it." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Even if these wild accusations were true, you've been complicit for years. You signed off on every project, every budget allocation. You're as guilty as anyone in this room." "She's right," Marcus admitted, surprising everyone, including himself. "I was complicit. I was too arrogant, too focused on profits and power to pay attention to the human cost of our decisions. But that ends today." Roberto smiled grimly, revealing a second folder. "Which brings us to the whistleblower protections and immunity agreements. Mr. Wellington has negotiated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It seems they've been very interested in certain construction projects and their unusual cost structures." The silence that followed was so profound that the building's ventilation system sounded like hurricane winds. Marcus looked around the table at faces that had transformed from predatory confidence to cornered animal desperation in mere minutes. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued. "Those of you who cooperate with the federal investigation will be allowed to resign quietly with minimal legal consequences. Those who choose to fight." He gestured to Roberto, who nodded grimly. "Will face criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering," Roberto finished. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the Department of Justice is very motivated to pursue high-profile corporate crime cases in an election year." Blackstone's face had gone from pale to crimson, veins bulging at his temples like topographic maps of rage. "You think you've won something here, boy? You think destroying everything your father built makes you a hero? You're still the same weak, pathetic child who needed a construction worker to save his worthless life." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but instead of crumbling, he stood straighter. David Chen's memory gave him strength. Maria's quiet dignity gave him purpose. Emma's innocent trust gave him hope. "My father built this company on the backs of people like David Chen," Marcus said clearly. "People who risked their lives every day while men like you skimmed profits and ignored safety protocols. That construction worker you're mocking, he died 3 months ago, broken, forgotten, while his wife cleans our offices at minimum wage to keep food on the table for their 7-year-old daughter." "How touching," Victoria sneered, but her voice cracked slightly. "Playing the bleeding heart won't save your company when the investors hear about this circus." Marcus smiled for the first time in days, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Actually, Victoria, I think you'll find that most of our legitimate investors will be quite relieved to know we're cleaning house, especially when they learn about the new direction Wellington Enterprises is taking." Roberto pulled out a final document. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the Wellington Foundation, a charitable organization that will redirect 30% of company profits toward affordable housing, education initiatives, and healthcare access for low-income families. The board meeting next week will be quite different from this one." Maria Chen had never imagined she'd be sitting in the executive conference room of Wellington Enterprises, but here she was, clutching Emma's hand while lawyers and accountants explained concepts that sounded like foreign languages. Marcus had insisted they be present for this meeting, something about transparency and accountability that made her heart race with nervousness. "Mrs. Chen," Roberto said gently, his kind eyes so reminiscent of David's that Maria felt tears threatening. "Your husband's safety reports were incredibly detailed. These documents prove that Harrison Wellington and his associates knew about the hazardous conditions, but chose to ignore them to save money." Emma, oblivious to the adult complexities surrounding her, was busy drawing pictures of unicorns on expensive legal paper. "Mama, why is everyone so serious? Are we in trouble?" "No, mi amor," Maria whispered, smoothing her daughter's golden hair. "We're helping make sure other daddies don't get hurt like yours did." Marcus watched this interaction with something approaching wonder. Despite everything they'd endured, Maria had raised a child who saw drawing unicorns as the appropriate response to corporate boardrooms. Emma's innocence was like a beacon of light in the darkness that had consumed his adult life. "The safety violations go back 15 years, Roberto continued, spreading photographs across the mahogany table. Multiple construction sites, dozens of injured workers, several deaths that were classified as industrial accidents when they were actually preventable tragedies caused by deliberate negligence. Marcus studied the faces in the photographs, men in hard hats, proud and strong, unaware that their employers valued their lives less than quarterly profit margins. David Chen appeared in several shots, always smiling, always the first to volunteer for the most dangerous jobs because they paid slightly better. "How many families?" Marcus asked quietly. 17 confirmed deaths, 43 permanent disabilities, hundreds of lesser injuries that were never properly compensated, Roberto replied grimly. "Your father's company saved approximately $12 million in safety equipment and procedures over the course of those projects." Maria's sharp intake of breath cut through the room like a knife. $12 million. That's more money than David made in his entire life. The weight of that statement settled over the room like lead blankets. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing David's calloused hands pulling him from the rubble, hearing David's voice promising that good people still existed in the world. The irony was crushing. The man who'd saved his life had ultimately been killed by his family's greed. "There's more," Roberto said carefully. "Mrs. Chen, your husband filed multiple safety complaints with OSHA in the months before the accident that killed him. Someone in Wellington Enterprises was actively suppressing those reports, paying bribes to delay inspections." "Who?" Marcus's voice was ice cold. "I want names." Theodore Blackstone was the primary contact with OSHA officials. Victoria Sterling handled the financial transfers. Your father, Harrison Wellington, signed off on all of it. Emma looked up from her unicorn drawing, sensing the tension in the room with the uncanny perception children possess. "Mama, why are you crying?" Maria quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile for her daughter. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're sad about things that happened before you were born, papito." Marcus knelt beside Emma's chair, his expensive suit creasing against the floor. "Emma, your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew. He saved my life when I was about your age, and now I want to make sure other little girls never lose their daddies the way you lost yours." "Will you bring Daddy back?" Emma asked with devastating innocence. "No, sweetheart, I can't do that," Marcus said gently, "but I can make sure his memory helps protect other families. Would you like that?" Emma considered this with the solemnity of a Supreme Court justice. Daddy always said helping people was the most important job in the world, even more important than making money. Roberto smiled, and for a moment the grief in his eyes softened. "David was right about that, Misha. He was right about a lot of things. The foundation will be named after your husband," Marcus told Maria. "The David Chen Foundation for Worker Safety and Family Support. Every safety protocol, every educational initiative, every dollar spent helping families like yours will carry his name." Maria broke down completely, years of suppressed grief and financial terror pouring out in great heaving sobs. But for the first time since David's death, these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of vindication, of the knowledge that her husband's sacrifice might finally mean something beyond her own private anguish. Emma patted her mother's hand with the matter-of-fact compassion of a child who'd grown up too fast. "It's okay, Mama. Daddy would like having his name on important things. He always said his name was the only thing he owned that was really worth something." Marcus looked around the conference room, at Roberto reviewing legal documents with quiet determination, at Maria crying tears of cathartic relief, at Emma drawing unicorns in a world that had tried to steal her childhood. These people, these beautiful, damaged, resilient people, had become his family in ways he'd never expected. And for the first time in his privileged, insulated life, Marcus Wellington understood what David Chen had meant about helping people being the most important job in the world. The basement archives of Wellington Enterprises hadn't been disturbed in years, evident from the thick layer of dust coating every surface like snow in an abandoned attic. Marcus descended the stairs with Roberto and a forensic accountant named Jennifer Walsh, their flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed to hold decades of buried secrets. "Your father was paranoid about digital records," Roberto observed, scanning rows of filing cabinets that stretched into shadows. "Everything important was kept in hard copy, locked away where hackers and subpoenas couldn't reach it." Marcus pulled out a drawer labeled Construction Projects 1998-2005 and immediately recognized his father's meticulous handwriting. Harrison Wellington had documented everything with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that information was power, but also potential evidence. "Jesus Christ," Jennifer whispered, holding up a folder thick with photographs and incident reports. "This is a systematic record of every safety violation, every bribed inspector, every worker injury that was covered up or misreported." The photographs were brutal. Men with crushed limbs, construction sites that looked like war zones, safety equipment that was clearly substandard or completely absent. But what made Marcus's stomach turn were his father's handwritten notes in the margins. Acceptable risk for profit margin. Worker replacement cost, $50,000 settlement versus $200,000 safety compliance. Human lives reduced to cost-benefit analysis. "Here," Roberto said grimly, extracting a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "This is addressed to you specifically. It's dated 3 days before your father's heart attack." Marcus's hands trembled as he broke the seal and extracted several sheets of expensive letterhead covered in Harrison's familiar script. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm dead and the wolves are circling. Blackstone and Sterling think they're clever, but I've been documenting their embezzlement for months. They're planning to push you out and liquidate the company assets to offshore accounts. The construction accidents were never accidents. They were calculated murders for profit. David Chen was getting too close to the truth. His cancer was induced by industrial chemicals we knew were carcinogenic. I couldn't stop it without exposing everything. The guilt is killing me faster than any heart condition. The evidence is in Safety Deposit Box 4471, First National Bank. Use it to destroy them before they destroy you. I was a monster, son. Don't become me, H.W. The letter fluttered to the concrete floor as Marcus staggered backward, his vision blurring with rage and horror. David hadn't died of random cancer. He'd been murdered by deliberate chemical exposure. The man who'd saved Marcus's life had been killed by Marcus's own family business. "Marcus," Roberto said carefully, "we need to call the FBI immediately. This isn't just financial fraud anymore. It's conspiracy to commit murder." 17 families, Marcus whispered, his voice hollow with shock. 17 men were murdered for profit margins, and I signed the paychecks of the people who killed them. Jennifer was photographing documents with swift efficiency, her camera flash illuminating horror after horror. The chemical exposure records are incredibly detailed. Your father documented everything. Which sites, which workers, which carcinogens were used. This is enough evidence to pursue criminal charges going back 20 years. But why would Harrison document his own crimes? Roberto wondered aloud. Marcus laughed bitterly, understanding his father's psychology with painful clarity. Insurance policy. He knew Blackstone and Sterling were thieves, but he needed leverage to control them. He never intended for justice to be served. He just wanted to make sure he stayed on top of the food chain. What changed? Jennifer asked. Why was he planning to expose them before he died? Me, Marcus realized with crushing certainty. I was starting to ask questions about the business, showing interest in operations instead of just profits. He was afraid I'd discover the truth and turn against him. Better to throw Blackstone and Sterling to the wolves than risk losing control of his son. Roberto placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. David would be proud of what you're doing now. This isn't about your father's guilt or your past complicity. It's about justice for people who never got the chance to speak for themselves. Marcus picked up the fallen letter, reading his father's words again. I was a monster, son. Don't become me. The irony was staggering. He'd already become exactly like Harrison Wellington, crushing people without thought or remorse. But unlike his father, he still had time to choose a different path. Call the FBI, Marcus said firmly. Call the Attorney General. Call every news outlet in Chicago. I want this story on every front page in America. The company will be destroyed, Jennifer warned. The civil lawsuits alone will bankrupt Wellington Enterprises. You'll lose everything. Marcus thought about Emma drawing unicorns in a boardroom where men discussed profit margins built on human suffering. He thought about Maria working 3 jobs to pay rent on an apartment that cost less than his monthly shoe allowance. He thought about David Chen, dying slowly from chemical poisoning while his killers counted money stained with blood. Good, Marcus said quietly. Some things deserve to be destroyed. The FBI raid on Wellington Enterprises began at dawn, with federal agents swarming through the building like antibodies attacking an infection. Marcus watched from his office window as Theodore Blackstone was led away in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled and his face twisted with impotent rage. Victoria Sterling followed 20 minutes later, her designer heels clicking against marble floors one final time before disappearing into an unmarked sedan. How are you holding up? Roberto asked, entering the office with coffee that actually smelled decent for once. Like a man who just discovered his entire life was built on mass murder, Marcus replied, but his voice carried strength rather than despair. The board wants to settle out of court. They're offering compensation packages to the families. How much? $50 million. Split 17 ways, with additional medical coverage for the survivors. Roberto whistled softly. That's generous by corporate standards. It's insulting by human standards, Marcus said firmly. David Chen's life was worth more than $3 million. Every one of those men was worth more than money can measure. Maria entered the office hesitantly, still uncomfortable with the idea that she belonged in executive spaces. Emma bounced beside her, wearing a new dress that Marcus had quietly arranged for through his assistant, the first new clothing the child had owned since her father's death. Mr. Marcus, Emma announced proudly, I told my teacher about Daddy being famous now. She said he was a hero even before everyone knew it. Your teacher is absolutely right, Marcus replied, kneeling to Emma's eye level. Heroes don't always get parades or statues. Sometimes they just do the right thing when no one is watching. The news people want to interview Maria, Roberto explained. 60 Minutes, CNN, The Tribune. David's story is going to be front-page news across the country. Maria shifted nervously, her cleaning uniform replaced by a simple but dignified black dress that Marcus had also quietly provided. "I don't know what to say to important people. My English isn't perfect, and I'm not good with cameras." "You don't need perfect English to tell the truth," Marcus assured her. "David's story needs to be heard, but only if you're comfortable sharing it." "Will it help other families?" Maria asked. "It will save lives," Roberto said with certainty. The new safety regulations being proposed in Congress are already being called the Chen Safety Act. David's name will be attached to legislation that could prevent thousands of workplace deaths. Emma tugged on Marcus's sleeve with the impatience of a 7-year-old who'd heard enough adult conversation. "Mr. Marcus, are you going to be poor now like us?" The question was so innocent, so perfectly direct, that Marcus burst into genuine laughter for the first time in months. "Probably, sweetheart. Is that okay with you?" "Poor people are nicer than rich people," Emma observed with devastating honesty. "Rich people made Daddy sick, but poor people bring you soup when you're sad." Marcus exchanged glances with Maria, who smiled despite her nervousness. "Emma has strong opinions about social economics," she explained. "She's not wrong," Marcus admitted. "I spent 30 years learning how to be rich, but I never learned how to be good." "Your daddy knew how to be both." "The foundation is approved," Roberto announced, consulting his tablet. "The David Chen Foundation will have an initial endowment of $200 million from the sale of company assets. That's enough to fund safety training, family support services, and educational scholarships indefinitely." What about Wellington Enterprises?" Maria asked. Marcus looked around his expensive office, at the awards and diplomas that meant nothing, at the view of a city where people like David Chen built everything, while people like himself took credit. "Wellington Enterprises is finished, but something better will take its place." "Chen Construction," Emma suggested helpfully, "named after Daddy, so everyone remembers he built good things." "Chen Construction," Marcus repeated slowly, tasting the words like wine. "A company that puts people before profits. Workers who get paid fairly, safety equipment that actually works, families that don't have to choose between paying rent and buying medicine." Roberto smiled broadly. David would love that irony. The construction company that killed him gets replaced by one built to honor his memory. "Will you really do it?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Start over with nothing?" Marcus looked at Emma, who was now drawing pictures of construction workers wearing proper safety equipment, and at Maria, whose quiet strength had taught him more about dignity than 30 years of privilege ever could. "I won't have nothing," he said quietly. "I'll have what David Chen had, a purpose worth living for." Outside the window, federal agents continued loading boxes of evidence into trucks, dismantling an empire built on blood and lies. But in this office, surrounded by the family he'd never known he needed, Marcus Wellington began planning something that might actually be worth building. 6 months after the FBI raids, Marcus Wellington stood in a construction trailer that smelled of coffee and honest sweat, reviewing blueprints for the first Chen construction project. Affordable housing that would actually be affordable, built by workers who went home safely to their families every night. "The investors are nervous," admitted Sarah Martinez, his new partner and former labor rights attorney who joined the company after Victoria Sterling's arrest. "They want to know how we can guarantee profits with all the safety overhead and fair wage requirements." "It's simple," Marcus replied, marking changes on the blueprints with a pencil worn smooth by use. "We don't guarantee profits. We guarantee that no one dies building homes for other people." The transformation hadn't been easy. The federal trials had consumed months of testimony, with Marcus serving as the star witness against his father's co-conspirators. The media attention had been brutal, some portraying him as a heroic whistleblower, others as a spoiled rich boy trying to buy redemption with blood money. But the hardest part had been learning how to live like a normal person. His penthouse apartment was gone, sold to pay legal fees and victim compensation. His fleet of luxury cars had been replaced by a used pickup truck that smelled faintly of Maria's coffee and Emma's strawberry lip balm. The Michelin-starred restaurants and private jets were memories now, replaced by family dinners at the kitchen table in Maria and Emma's new two-bedroom apartment. "Mr. Marcus!" Emma's voice carried across the construction site as she ran toward the trailer, her school backpack bouncing with each step. At 8 years old now, she'd grown taller, but no less enthusiastic about interrupting important business meetings. "How was school today?" Marcus asked, automatically checking her hands and face for signs of playground injuries, a paternal instinct he'd never known he possessed. "Mrs. Peterson said, 'I'm the best reader in 2nd grade,' Emma announced proudly. 'And Tommy Miller said his daddy got a job with your company building houses. Is that true?' 'It's true,' Marcus confirmed. 'Your daddy's company is hiring good people who want to build things the right way.' Emma beamed with pride that could have powered the construction site. In the month since David's story had made national news, she'd transformed from a shy child afraid of powerful adults to a confident little girl who understood that her father's memory was changing the world. Maria appeared in the trailer doorway, still wearing the simple work clothes she preferred, despite Marcus's gentle suggestions about updating her wardrobe. She'd accepted a position as the Foundation's community liaison, helping other families navigate the complex process of accessing support services and compensation. "The Rodriguez family wants to thank you personally," Maria reported. "Miguel starts his safety training next week, and Carmen says it's the first real job he's had in 2 years. Marcus nodded, making notes on his ever-present clipboard. Chen Construction was small still, only 43 employees, but every hire represented a family lifted out of poverty, a father who would come home safely, a child who wouldn't grow up wondering why Daddy never returned from work. "There's something else," Maria continued, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "The city council approved the memorial. David's name will be on a plaque at the new community center, along with the other 16 men who died. And the David Chen Community Center would serve 3 low-income neighborhoods, providing job training, childcare, and healthcare access to families who'd been forgotten by politicians and ignored by corporations. It was everything David had believed in, built with money extracted from the people who'd killed him. Daddy would like having a building named after him," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He always said his name was the only thing he really owned." "Your daddy owned a lot more than his name," Marcus told her gently. "He owned the respect of everyone who knew him, the love of his family, and the knowledge that he'd made the world a better place." Roberto emerged from the back office, carrying legal documents and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd just won another victory against corporate malfeasance. "The final settlement checks are ready for distribution," he announced. "Every family will receive their full compensation by Friday. And the money wouldn't bring back the dead or heal the permanently disabled, but it would ensure that children got to attend college, that widows didn't lose their homes, that medical bills didn't destroy whatever remained of lives already shattered by corporate greed." "What about Blackstone and Sterling?" Sarah asked. 25 to life for Blackstone, 15 for Sterling," Roberto replied with grim satisfaction. "They'll die in federal prison, which seems appropriate for people who killed others for profit margins." Marcus felt no satisfaction at his former colleagues' fates. Prison couldn't resurrect David Chen or undo the suffering they'd caused. But it might discourage other executives from viewing human lives as acceptable losses in quarterly earnings reports. "I have an idea," Emma announced, with the confidence of a child accustomed to having her suggestions taken seriously. What if we put Daddy's picture in every house we build? So families remember that someone who cared about them helped make their homes safe. The adults exchanged glances, struck by the simple perfection of the suggestion. David Chen's gentle smile watching over families in homes built with integrity and love. It was exactly the kind of legacy he would have wanted. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Mija," Maria said, her voice thick with pride and lingering grief. Marcus looked around the construction trailer, at blueprints marked with safety notations, at employee schedules that prioritized human dignity over maximum efficiency, at Emma's drawing of her father, wearing a hard hat and angel wings. This wasn't the empire he'd inherited, but it was the legacy he was choosing to build. Outside, the sound of hammers and saws created the rhythm of honest work, performed by people who trusted that their employer valued their lives more than profit margins. It was a sound David Chen would have recognized, would have been proud to hear. And for the first time since childhood, Marcus Wellington felt like he was finally doing something worth doing. 1 year later, Marcus Wellington stood before the gleaming bronze plaque that read, "David Chen Community Center, where heroes are remembered and hope lives on." The autumn Chicago wind carried the laughter of children playing in the new playground, the sound of hammers from the construction training program, and the gentle murmur of families finding the help they'd never dared ask for. Emma, now 9, and gap-toothed from losing her front teeth, pressed her small hand into the fresh concrete beside her father's memorial garden. "Daddy would love seeing all the kids playing here," she said, with the wisdom of a child who'd learned that love doesn't end with death. He always said playgrounds were the most important buildings because that's where kids learn to be happy. Marcus knelt beside her, his work-calloused hands now as rough as David's had been. The expensive manicures were a memory from another life, replaced by honest cuts and scrapes earned through real labor. "Your daddy was right about a lot of things, sweetheart. He was especially right about the power of simple kindness." Maria emerged from the community center's main entrance, her arms full of enrollment forms from families seeking job training, childcare and healthcare assistance. At 34, she'd grown into her role as the foundation's director with natural grace, her English now confident, and her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived the worst and chosen to help others do the same. "The Rodriguez family just found out Miguel got accepted to the apprenticeship program," she announced, her smile radiant with shared joy. Carmen started crying right there in the lobby. She said it's the first time in 3 years she's cried happy tears. Audrey, the apprenticeship program, was Marcus's proudest achievement. Young men and women from low-income families learning construction skills in environments that prioritize safety above all else. Every graduate received not just technical training, but education about worker rights, fair wages, and the knowledge that their lives had value beyond their productivity. "Mr. Marcus," Emma tugged on his sleeve with familiar insistence, "will you tell the story again, about the coffee and the bracelet and how Daddy saved you twice?" "Oui." Marcus had told this story dozens of times to donors, reporters and community groups, but he never tired of sharing it. The truth had power that grew with each telling, inspiring others to believe that redemption was possible even for the most unlikely people. "Your daddy saved me the first time when I was 10 years old," Marcus began, settling onto the Memorial Gardens bench, while Emma climbed into his lap with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd never known him as a monster. "I was trapped and scared, and he risked his own life to pull me to safety. But the second time he saved me was even more important." Maria sat beside them, her weathered hands folding over Marcus's in a gesture of family intimacy that still amazed him. 2 years ago, he would have fired her for even speaking to him directly. Now, she was the closest thing to family he'd ever known. "The second time was through you," Marcus continued, looking into Emma's bright eyes that held so much of David's gentle wisdom. "When you brought me coffee that day, you wore your daddy's bracelet. You showed me what real kindness looked like. You reminded me that there was still good in the world, even when I'd forgotten how to see it." "And then you changed from being mean to being nice," Emma added helpfully, having heard this story enough times to know all the important parts. "I had to learn how to be nice," Marcus corrected gently. "It took a lot of practice, and I made many mistakes, but your mama and you were patient teachers." The memorial garden was filling with families as the afternoon community barbecue began. Children who might have been fatherless due to workplace accidents instead ran safely between tables, loaded with food prepared by volunteers. Their parents, construction workers, janitors, teachers and nurses shared stories and laughter without fear of corporate retaliation or economic insecurity. Roberto approached the group, his legal briefcase replaced by a plate of Maria's famous tamales, and a smile that reminded everyone why David had been so proud of his younger brother. "The final numbers are in," he announced. "The Chen Safety Act has been adopted by 12 states and is being considered for federal legislation. Workplace deaths in construction have dropped 30% in areas where our safety protocols have been implemented." "How many lives saved?" Maria asked, her voice soft with wonder. "Conservative estimates suggest over 400 people who would have died in workplace accidents are going home safely to their families," Roberto replied. "David's legacy is literally saving lives every single day." Emma squirmed with excitement, as if her small body couldn't contain the magnitude of her father's continuing impact. "Daddy's helping people even though he's in heaven. That makes him extra special, right?" "It makes him eternal," Marcus said quietly, understanding finally what David had meant about some things being more valuable than money. "Heroes never really die, Emma. They live on in every life they touch, every person they inspire to be better." As the sun began to set over Chicago, casting golden light through the community center's windows, Marcus reflected on the impossible journey that had brought him here. He'd lost billions of dollars, a corporate empire, and a lifestyle of unlimited privilege. In return, he'd gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that his life had meaning beyond profit margins and power. The David Chen Foundation had helped over 2,000 families access safe housing, job training, and health care. Chen Construction had completed 47 projects without a single serious injury. The community center served 3 neighborhoods with programs that had lifted hundreds of families out of poverty. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned what David Chen had always known, that the most important job in the world was helping people, and that simple acts of kindness could change everything. "Mr. Marcus," Emma said as the barbecue wound down and families began heading home, "I have something for you." She reached into her small purse and pulled out a thermos decorated with unicorn stickers. "It's coffee, like the first day we met. Mama made it special, with extra sugar because you look sad again." Marcus accepted the thermos with hands that trembled slightly, remembering another coffee cup offered by another small hand in what seemed like another lifetime. "Why do you think I look sad, sweetheart?" "Because you miss Daddy too, even though you didn't know him very long when you were little," Emma said with devastating insight. "But it's okay to be sad sometimes. Mama says that's how we know we loved someone." Maria squeezed Marcus's shoulder gently. "David would be so proud of the man you've become," she whispered. "Not because of the buildings or the money or the laws with his name on them, but because you learned to love the right things." As Marcus sipped the coffee, perfect as always, he looked around at the community they'd built together from the ashes of his father's empire. Children played safely in a playground, funded by blood money, transformed into instruments of healing. Adults found dignity in honest work that valued their humanity above their productivity. Families discovered that asking for help wasn't shameful but human, and in the center of it all, David Chen's memory lived on, not as a victim of corporate greed, but as a catalyst for transformation that had saved countless lives and touched thousands of hearts. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the evening sky, unsure if he was speaking to David, to God, or to the mysterious forces that had brought a 7-year-old girl with a cup of coffee into his life when he needed redemption most. Emma patted his hand with the gentle authority of a child who'd appointed herself the keeper of adult emotions. "Daddy hears you," she said confidently. "He told me so in a dream. He said you were worth saving, just like he always knew you would be." And Marcus Wellington, former billionaire, reformed monster, grateful human being, finally understood that being worth saving was the only wealth that truly mattered.